It was a cold, windy morning in the city. The streets were busy. People walked fast, holding hot coffee cups and wearing thick jackets. Cars moved slowly through traffic. Everyone was in a hurry. On one corner, an elderly black woman named Miss Eleanor walked slowly with a wooden cane. Her back was slightly bent, and her steps were small. She wore an old gray coat and a hat. Her eyes were tired, but her face was calm. She didn't speak to anyone. She just walked slowly toward a nearby store to buy some bread and milk. She was almost at the door when a police car stopped near the sidewalk. A young white cop, Officer Ray, stepped out. He looked angry and tense. He had seen Miss Eleanor standing there for a moment and thought she was begging or causing trouble. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at her face. He only saw her coat, her slow steps, and her skin color. "Hey, you can't stand here!" Officer Ray shouted. Miss Eleanor turned her head, surprised. "Excuse me?" she asked softly. "I said move along, ma'am. You're loitering. This isn't allowed here," he said, walking closer. "I'm just going to the store," she said, holding her cane. But Ray didn't listen. He grabbed her arm roughly and pushed her backward. The old woman lost her balance and fell to the ground, her cane rolling away. She gasped in pain but didn't cry out. People on the street stopped and stared. A few took out their phones and started recording. "Sir, please." "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "Stay down. Don't move." Officer Ray shouted again. One woman in the crowd yelled, "She's an old lady! What are you doing?" But Ray ignored the voices. He was breathing hard, still thinking he was in control. Miss Eleanor looked up at him, calm but sad. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the crowd. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked. Ray froze. Something in her voice stopped him. It was not fear. It was something else. Power? Wisdom? He didn't know, but the way she looked at him made him feel small. For a moment, the street became quiet. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. An ambulance came and took Miss Eleanor to the hospital. Officer Ray gave his report, but something felt wrong. Deep down, he knew he had made a mistake. He tried to act normal, but he kept hearing her voice in his head. "Do you even know who I am?" Later that day, the video of the incident started spreading online. It was on social media, news sites, and even TV. People were angry. Comments poured in. "This is disgusting. That poor woman. That cop didn't even ask her anything. Does anyone know who she is?" By the next morning, Officer Ray was called into the chief's office. The chief looked serious. He didn't smile. He slid a printed page across the desk. It showed a photo of Miss Eleanor, years younger, standing beside a famous U.S. president. Another photo showed her at a courtroom giving a speech. "You really messed up, Ray," the chief said, voice low. Ray picked up the paper and stared. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just any woman. This was Miss Eleanor Parker, a retired civil rights lawyer, a community leader, a hero. She had fought for justice her entire life, and he had pushed her to the ground like she was nothing. His hands shook. I didn't know," he said. The chief shook his head. "That's the problem. You didn't even try to know." Outside, the world was changing fast. Reporters waited outside the hospital. People brought flowers and cards. Miss Eleanor stayed quiet, resting in her room. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't shout. But her silence was loud. Her quiet power shook the city. In a dark apartment, Officer Ray sat alone. He watched the video of himself again and again. The anger on his face, the way she fell, the calm in her eyes. And that one question, "Do you even know who I am?" He had no answer, but he knew this was just the beginning. Officer Ray couldn't sleep that night. He sat on his small couch, staring at the ceiling. The TV was still on, but he wasn't watching. His mind kept going back to that moment, Miss Eleanor on the ground, the crowd, the phone cameras, and her voice. "Do you even know who I am?" He felt something deep inside, guilt, confusion, and shame. He had never felt like this before. The next morning, he sat in the police station, silent. The chief walked in and threw a folder on his desk. "Start reading," the chief said. Ray slowly opened the folder. His eyes moved across the pages. There were newspaper clippings, court photos, and official awards. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Eleanor Parker, age 76, former civil rights lawyer, activist, advocate. He saw an old black and white photo of a young Eleanor standing on the steps of a courthouse holding a sign, "Equal Rights for All." Another photo showed her at a large protest in Washington, standing next to famous leaders. One article said she defended a wrongfully accused teenager in 1983 and won. Another said she once stopped a violent eviction by standing in front of a bulldozer. Ray leaned back, stunned. "This can't be the same woman," he whispered. "Oh, it's her," the chief said. "She's a legend in this city, and you treated her like garbage." Ray wanted to explain, but he couldn't find the words. He had judged her without knowing anything about her. Later that day, he drove to the hospital. He didn't wear his uniform. He wore a plain hoodie and jeans. He stood outside Eleanor's room, unsure if he should go in. Through the small window, he saw her sitting up in bed. She was writing something in a notebook. A nurse came in and handed her a box. It was old and wooden, with small gold corners. Eleanor opened it slowly. Ray watched as she pulled out letters, medals, and photographs. One photo made him step back. It was Eleanor shaking hands with the President of the United States. Ray felt like the ground moved under his feet. Who was this woman? Why had he never heard of her? The nurse looked surprised. "You did all this?" she asked Eleanor. Eleanor smiled softly. "I did what I could. There's still much more to do." Ray turned and walked away from the window. He felt small, like a child who had done something terrible. He sat in a chair down the hall and buried his face in his hands. The next morning, he searched her name online. Page after page came up. Her work in law, her speeches, the people she helped, videos, articles, even a book written about her. He watched one video of a young Eleanor speaking at a school. Her voice was strong. "Don't ever look at a person and think you know their story," she said. "You only see the surface. If you want to understand someone, look deeper." Those words hit him like a punch. At the same time, the city was waking up to who Miss Eleanor really was. The story was on every news channel. Hero lawyer assaulted by cop. Eleanor Parker, a name we should never forget. From civil rights to today's fight, her story isn't over. People who knew her began sharing memories. She helped me when I was homeless. She saved my brother from prison. She stood by us when no one else did. Back in the hospital, Eleanor closed her notebook. She looked out the window, her eyes calm. She knew people were talking, but she didn't care about the noise. She only wondered, would the man who hurt her truly learn anything? Or would he walk away unchanged, like so many before him? Outside the hospital, Officer Ray stood again, this time with flowers in his hand. But this wasn't just about saying sorry, it was the beginning of something else. Years ago, long before the world knew her name, Eleanor Parker was just a young girl living in a small, broken neighborhood. She saw things most children shouldn't see: police beating her father for no reason, neighbors being kicked out of, homes and schools where black children were treated like they didn't matter. But even as a child, Eleanor wasn't afraid. She asked questions no one else dared to ask. Why do they treat us like this? Why don't we fight back? Her mother used to tell her, "One day, you'll be the voice they can't ignore." And she was right. In her early 20s, Eleanor joined peaceful marches. She stood in front of buildings holding signs that said, "We deserve justice. Our lives matter too." She was arrested 3 times before her 25th birthday. In jail, she would sit in the cold, bruised and tired, but never silent. She used every minute to speak, to write letters, to plan her next move. She studied law while working as a waitress. Every night, she read law books under a weak lamp. She told herself, "If I can't break the system, I'll learn how to beat it from the inside." And she did. At 29, she became one of the first black women in her city to pass the bar exam. People didn't believe it at first. Even some of the judges laughed when she walked into the courtroom, until she opened her mouth. She defended poor families who were about to lose their homes. She took on police brutality cases that no one else would touch. She helped boys wrongly, accused of crimes they didn't commit. In one case, she saved a 14-year-old boy from going to prison for life. The boy's mother called her an angel, but Eleanor didn't see herself as a hero. She just wanted to help. Back in the present day, Officer Ray sat in the library of the police station. He had asked the chief for time to read through old city records. He wanted to know everything about Eleanor. He read a case file from 1991. Eleanor defending a pregnant woman who had been beaten by officers. She won that case. The officers were fired. He found a photo from 1997. Eleanor standing at a school, giving books to children. She had raised money for the school herself after it lost funding. Ray's eyes burned. He rubbed his face and whispered, "How did I not know any of this?" Later that day, he visited her neighborhood. It was old now. The buildings had cracks, but the people remembered her. A shop owner told him, "She gave me this shop when I was about to give up." A teenage girl said, "She bought my school uniform when my parents couldn't." Ray was quiet. For the first time, he understood that the woman he had hurt wasn't just a victim. She was a warrior. A quiet, powerful warrior. He walked back to his car. In his hand was an old newspaper a man had given him. On the front was Eleanor's face and the words, "The woman who never backed down." Ray sat behind the wheel and looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't like what he saw, and he knew he had a long way to go. Officer Ray stood outside the hospital again. His heart was beating fast. He held a small note in his hand and a bouquet of white lilies, the kind his mother used to love. He had practiced what he would say all night, but now that he was here, his mouth was dry. He had no badge on, no uniform, just plain clothes and tired eyes. He asked the nurse at the front desk, "Is Miss Eleanor awake?" The nurse nodded. "She's expecting you." Ray blinked. "She knows I'm coming," she said. "Let the young man in. He has something to learn." Ray walked slowly into the room. Miss Eleanor sat up in bed, her hands resting on a warm blanket. The TV was off. The window was open. Sunlight fell across her face. She looked at him, calm, strong. He stood by the door, unsure. "Miss Parker, He stopped. She waited. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said finally, "for what I did, for how I treated you. I judged you without knowing anything. I thought you were just—" She raised her hand gently. "No one is ever just anything," she said. "That's where most people go wrong." Ray stepped forward, eyes full of shame. "I've been reading about your life, your cases, your speeches, the people you helped. I didn't know. I didn't even ask your name." Eleanor looked into his eyes. "And if I wasn't on the news, if no one had told you who I was, would you still be here now?" The room became silent. Ray looked down. "I don't know." She nodded slowly. "That's the problem, son. Justice shouldn't depend on names, titles, or fame. It should depend on humanity, on how we treat people when no one's watching." Ray sat in the chair beside her bed. He handed her the note. "I wrote something. It's not much, but—" She opened it. It read, "I didn't see you. I didn't try, but now I do, and I will never look away again. Eleanor folded the paper and placed it beside her. You can't fix the past with flowers and notes, she said, but you can change the future, if you're brave enough. Ray nodded. I want to learn. I want to help. I don't want to be that man anymore. She looked at him for a long time, then said softly, Then don't be. A nurse entered quietly and said visiting time was over. Ray stood to leave. He turned at the door. If you ever need anything, Eleanor smiled gently. I've already done my part. It's your turn now. As he walked out of the hospital, the sky seemed a little brighter. But inside, Ray felt the heavy weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about an apology. This was a beginning. That night, Ray sat down at his desk and opened a blank notebook, On. The first page, he wrote, Day 1, listening, learning, changing. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where to start. It started with one post. A nurse who had spoken with Miss Eleanor shared her photo online. The caption said, This woman once stood in front of bulldozers to save families, and now she's healing from police abuse. We must do better. Within hours, thousands of people were sharing the post. Then came the news stories, interviews, and videos. Eleanor's face was everywhere, TV screens, news apps, and city walls. But more than that, her story was spreading. People began asking, Who is Miss Eleanor? Why haven't we heard of her before? A teacher made her story part of a classroom lesson. A bookstore placed her biography at the front window. A college invited her to speak, even while she was still healing, but Eleanor wasn't focused on fame. She sat quietly in her hospital bed, watching the noise grow around her. She was tired but hopeful. Meanwhile, Officer Ray was changing. Every day he visited her old neighborhood. He listened to stories from elders. He walked the same streets she had walked for decades, this time not as a cop, but as a student of truth. He visited schools and spoke to kids about respect and justice. But he didn't pretend to be a hero. He told them, I made a mistake, but I chose to learn from it. So can you. He even helped clean up a park that had once been a protest site led by Eleanor in the 80s. An old man clapped him on the back and said, She would have wanted you to see this place as more than just concrete. Back at the hospital, Eleanor finally stood up from her bed after weeks of rest. Her legs shook, but she held on to the railing and smiled. A young woman no older than 22 came into her room with flowers. She looked nervous. I just wanted to say thank you, she said softly. My mom told me how you helped her when no one else would. I'm studying law now. Because of you. Eleanor looked at her, eyes warm. Good, she said. The world needs more fighters. At City Hall, something unexpected happened. A councilman, once silent about abuse cases, now stood before cameras and said, Miss Eleanor's story has reminded us who we've failed. It's time for real change. Laws were being rechecked. Police training was under review. People started watching not just what happened, but why it kept happening. A mural appeared overnight on a tall building. It showed Eleanor as a young woman with her fist raised, and below it the words, She fought then. We fight now. That image traveled far beyond the city. People in other states, other countries, were talking about her, not just as a victim, but as a voice, a force. And through it all, Eleanor stayed humble. She looked at the world changing and whispered to herself, Maybe I didn't finish the fight, but I lit the fire. It had been weeks since Eleanor left the hospital. She moved slowly now, walking with a cane, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Her home was filled with letters, hundreds of them, some from people she knew, most from strangers. You gave me hope. You made me believe again. I'm going to fight, like you did. One morning, a black car pulled up in front of her home. A well-dressed woman stepped out and knocked on the door. Eleanor opened it carefully. "Miss Parker," the woman said, smiling. "I'm from the office of the president. We'd like to invite you to the White House." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "The White House?" "Yes," the woman said. "You've become a symbol of truth, justice, and strength. The president would like to honor you with the Freedom Medal." Eleanor didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "I didn't do any of this for medals." "We know," the woman replied gently. "That's why you deserve it." News of the invitation spread fast. TV channels ran breaking news. Civil rights icon Eleanor Parker invited to the White House. Some people cheered, some cried. Some were angry that it took this long for the world to see her. But Eleanor, she stayed quiet. Later that day, Officer Ray came to visit her. He stood at her gate, unsure if he should come in. She waved him over. "I heard," he said, smiling. "You're going to Washington." "I haven't decided yet," she replied. Ray looked confused. "Why not?" Eleanor sat on her porch and stared at the street. Children were playing. Cars passed by. Life was moving, slowly. She said, "I never wanted fame. I just wanted justice. What good is a medal if the fight still isn't over?" Ray nodded. He sat beside her. "But maybe," he said softly, "that medal will shine a light on the parts of this country still in darkness." Eleanor smiled a little. "Maybe you're smarter than I thought." He laughed quietly. "I had a good teacher." 2 days later, Eleanor made her decision. She would go to Washington, but on one condition. She would speak in her own words to the nation. The White House agreed. When the day came, Eleanor stood on the big stage, her cane beside her, her voice calm, her eyes filled with fire. She didn't talk about her pain. She didn't talk about what was done to her. She talked about everyone else. "This medal doesn't belong to me," she said. "It belongs to every person who was silenced, every child who was told they didn't matter, every voice that was ignored. I accept this not as a reward, but as a promise, that we will keep going, that we will keep fighting, that justice will never retire." The room was silent. Then came thunderous applause. Back in her city, the same crowd that once watched her suffer was now watching her shine. But Eleanor didn't need the cheers. She had one simple thought in her heart. Let them remember not my name, but my fight. Eleanor Parker returned home quietly after her White House speech. She didn't care about the cameras, the reporters, or the medal they had placed around her neck. She placed it in a drawer next to her childhood notebook, the same one where she once wrote, "One day I will change something," and now she had. But what happened next was bigger than even she imagined. In schools across the country, teachers began teaching lessons about her life, not from textbooks, but from real letters, real stories, and real people. Children raised their hands and asked, "How can we be like Miss Eleanor?" One little girl, shy and quiet, stood in front of her class and said, "I want to be a lawyer, just like her." In police stations, new officers were now required to take a special class named the Eleanor Principle, focused on respect, empathy, and human dignity. Officer Ray, who once made the mistake of his life, became the first to teach it. He stood in front of young recruits and said, "If you wear this badge, remember, your power doesn't make you right. Your kindness makes you strong." A new legal center opened in Eleanor's city, the Parker Justice House, offering free help to families in need. Eleanor visited once a week. She didn't make speeches. She just listened and guided. One afternoon, a teenage boy walked in, nervous, angry. He said, "They think I'm just a problem." She looked at him, smiled gently, and replied, "So did they think of me. Let's prove them wrong." And then came the moment no one expected. The mayor of the city called a press conference. in front of flashing lights and microphones. He said, "From this day forward, the city park will be renamed Eleanor Parker Square, so generations can walk where she once marched and remember the woman who stood even when the world tried to knock her down." Eleanor visited the park quietly the next morning. Children were playing. A small statue of her stood under a tree. She touched the base of it and whispered, "It was never about statues. It was about souls." A young girl noticed her. She ran over. "Are you Miss Eleanor?" She smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. Can I take a picture with you?" Eleanor chuckled. "Only if you promise to use your voice when it matters." The girl nodded fast. "I promise." They stood together, the old and the young, one who had fought and one who would carry the fight forward. That night, as the sun set over the city, Eleanor sat by her window with her notebook in her lap. She opened to a fresh page and wrote, "I didn't change the whole world, but I helped someone who will." And with that final line, she closed the book and smiled, because the legacy had begun. Months passed. Eleanor Parker's days were quieter now. No speeches, no cameras, no awards, just a cup of tea in the morning, and letters from people whose lives she had touched. One day, as she watered the flowers in her garden, a black and white police car pulled up quietly in front of her house. For a moment, she froze. Old memories stirred. Then the door opened, and out stepped Officer Ray. He was in uniform, but different now. His posture calm, his eyes kind. He wasn't alone. With him was a young woman wearing a new badge, nervous, looking down at her shoes. Ray walked up to Eleanor and smiled. "Miss Parker," he said, "this is Officer Kiara James. She's the first graduate from our Justice Reform Training Program. She asked to meet you." Eleanor looked at the young woman. Kiara stepped forward and said softly, "I joined the force because of your story. Because I didn't want people to feel fear when they saw this uniform. I wanted to change what it meant." Eleanor studied her carefully, then nodded. "Then wear it with courage. And don't forget who you protect." Kiara smiled. "I won't." They sat on the porch, talking. Kiara listened. Ray listened. Eleanor spoke of the old days, of protest marches, jail cells, and victories that no one put in the papers, but she also spoke of hope. Hope she hadn't always had, until now. As the sun began to set, Kiara stood up. "I'll come back. If..." "That's okay," Eleanor smiled. "Bring a notebook next time." That night, Eleanor sat alone in her room. She looked at her old photo albums, pictures of protests, courtrooms, and children she had helped. She picked up her notebook one more, time, and on the last page, she wrote, "If one person stands up, others will follow. I stood, now they run, and that is enough." She closed her eyes and rested. The next morning, news quietly spread across the neighborhood. Eleanor Parker had passed peacefully in her sleep. There were no parades, no loud speeches, just candles on porches, flowers on her steps, and silence, filled with love. But across the city and across the country, people remembered. Murals lit up with her face. Children read her name aloud in school. Police recruits whispered her quotes before stepping into their first shift. And on every city corner her words echoed, "Kindness is not weakness, justice is not a favor, and silence is never safety." Years later, a girl stood in a courtroom. Young, fierce, brave. She wore a pin that read, "Parker Legacy," and as she began her first case fighting for justice, she whispered under her breath, "This one's for you, Miss Eleanor." The world had changed because one woman refused to be silent, and now the world was listening.